Okay, man. Could me have it done. Oh, Mama,
The last question before is the question that
my body. Sorry.
First, Maria casually scatters sacred corn, an offering to the Great Spirit for providing the raw clay.
When we go to get the clay, we have to get ready some blue cornmeal and throw it to the clay so the Great Spirit will help us and give us our strength and good party, and all that we have to ask for all our people. We not just go and get the clay. We have to ask Great Spirit. All the old folks, they do. All the Indians, they do.
At another site in the area, blue sand is gathered. Mixed with clay, the sand acts as a binder.
We believe in working in harmony with nature. We do not allow ourselves more material than just what is actually becomes necessary to serve our purpose.
Equal amounts of red clay and blue sand are mixed together. Water is added, is slowly and carefully worked into the clay until the mass is pliable. The amount of moisture is critical. Too little and the clay crumbles. Too much and the clay will not bind. Next, strong and experienced hands knead the clay, pounding, dividing, pressing. Air bubbles are worked out and the mass becomes cohesive and smooth. It is not used right away, but is set aside for a day, during which it is periodically kneaded so as to ensure an even texture throughout. It becomes very plastic. This step is deceptive in that it appears simple. Strength and dexterity as well as experience are required to properly judge the condition of the clay.
These polishing stones, says Maria, will be handed on to my daughters and granddaughters. Apart from their sentimental value, the carefully selected polishing stones are an important item in the armamentarium of the Indian potter. The decoration of the pottery of Maria was first developed by her husband, Julian. Today, her son, Popo Vide, working with a brush made from a yucca leaf and a pale clay slip, lays the design which, when fired, will appear as a matte black on the shining, almost iridescent black of the ware.
Ayer penaba por verte. 방법들만 하면 되는 거지. 자, 아버지 소리는 거의 아버지 소리는 거의 적응되네. 개토보다 생각이 있으니 뭐.
이거 잘 보니까 조금 아프다.
Here in Shigaraki are many potteries, and each slanted roof in the town covers a Japanese climbing kiln. The creation of beauty has permeated all aspects of life in Japan. Not only works of sculpture and painting, but also objects for everyday use are appreciated as art. The strongest individual potter in Shigaraki is Mr. Rokusai, who is highly regarded for his vigorous wear produced by the traditional method of coiling and throwing. After he has flattened the ball of clay on a wooden bat, he rolls the coil in the air and pinches it onto the base. When all the coils have been laid up, Mr. Rokusai skillfully shapes the clay into the lower half of a large planter. Because the finished pot will be rather large, it is made in 2 stages. After the first portion is completed, it is removed from the wheel and carried outside to stiffen. When it has become stiff enough to support the addition of new coils, it is brought back to the wheel and recentered. Then Mr. Rokusai inserts a weight to keep the pot in place. The work of the second stage includes adding coils, knitting them together, and pulling up the sides into a large, handsome planter. This coiling and throwing method is widely used throughout Japan for several practical reasons. One is that there is virtually no limit to the size of the pot that can be made. Another is that the coiling and throwing method requires less strength than trying to wrestle a large pot from one big lump of clay. The clay used in this planter weighs about 30 pounds. Mr. Rokusai uses native Shigaraki clay, which contains chunks of feldspar that begin to melt out in the firing and become white spottings, as the surface of this water container shows. No glaze has been applied. To finish his pieces, the potter depends on the accumulation of wood ash, which makes a natural glaze, typical of good Shigaraki ware. The water container, this flower vase, these boxes for powdered tea, and the tea bowl are all for use in the Japanese tea ceremony, Cha no Yu. In Shigaraki, the kilns of the various potters are stoked by professional firemen who must know exactly how to judge the heat and its effects on the clay. In this climbing kiln of 11 chambers, the fireman first stokes the bottom chamber until it reaches the proper temperature, about 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Then each consecutive chamber is brought up to temperature, and firing the entire kiln takes about 5 days. Another type of pottery that has a rugged, natural finish and that takes its name from the region where it is made is bizenware. Linear patterns such as these are one of the identifying features of bizenware. These lines are created by stacking the pots in the kiln with pieces of rice straw soaked in brine, which when burned leave trails similar to calligraphy. These bizen pieces are the work of Mr. Kaneshige, a potter who has been named a national treasure, a title bestowed by the Japanese government on outstanding artists. Mr. Kaneshige makes pottery especially for the tea ceremony and for the tea house. Here, with the help of an assistant, he is making a large bowl. As Mr. Kaneshige works, his assistant must adjust the speed of the wheel to his needs. This vertical shape will become a traditional flower vase to be used in the tea house. The shapes of bizenware, and particularly shigaraki pottery, are rugged and strong, full of character, not refined. When it is completed, the vase will be left unglazed. Both shigaraki ware and bizenware rely on the accumulation of melting wood ash to produce a natural glaze. In a pottery making region such as Bizen, techniques are handed down from father to son. Here Mr. Kaneshige's son, Mitsuaki, is preparing the clay by wedging or kneading in the traditional manner, which produces a flower-like pattern. The custom in Japan is that the son follows time-honored practices of his father and ancestors. However, in this case, Mitsuaki is giving a traditional form a slightly individualistic variation. Japanese people who highly value pieces of pottery have special wooden boxes made for them. Each container is designed specifically to fit the individual pot. An owner would keep the pot boxed and carefully tied with an attractive ribbon, removing it only to show to special visitors. These pots are excellent examples of mishima decoration, an old Korean technique that can be identified by patterns of inlaid white clay. In the town of Mashiko is the new studio of the famous potter Mr. Shimaoka. He makes matching teacups by throwing them off the top of a lump of clay. A special advantage of using this technique is that he does not continually have to center little lumps of clay. Japanese potters have a special regard for the interior of a pot. Mr. Shimaoka shapes the piece from within by means of a long-handled wooden tool called a rib. Working in this way, he lets the outside surface follow the inner contours. When finished, the cup is cut loose with a string and placed beside the ones previously thrown. With the remaining clay, he makes a large vase, again working both with his hands and with a long-handled rib. Careful attention is given to the finishing of a strong rim, and a piece of wet leather is used for this purpose. To lift the vase from the wheel, Mr. Shimaoka uses pieces of split bamboo so that he need not handle the work excessively and possibly mar the surface. Many tools, such as scrapers, stamps, and paddles, are employed in developing mishima decorations. Here Mr. Shimaoka rolls braided string over a pot to create a pattern. Next, he brushes on a white clay slip. The final step involves scraping slip off the projecting portions. Thus, he prepares a mishima decoration. After such applications, pots are carried outside to dry before being taken to the kiln. Another outstanding potter is Mr. Kato Takuo, who lives in the city of Tajimi, and who is known for using traditional glazes on original forms. This famous traditional Japanese glaze is called oil spot tomoku. It is black with brown spottings. Mr. Kato is working with porcelain clay. Because its smooth, buttery consistency makes throwing a large pot difficult, he utilizes the very practical technique of throwing two identical cylinders. After carefully checking the dimensions, he places the first section atop the second. Now, working with the enlarged cylinder, he throws a large, deep bowl. Many Japanese potters prefer that the finished work not have a mechanical roundness. Therefore, Mr. Kato welcomes the fact that the pot is off-center and makes no attempt to achieve perfect centering, which he would regard as being rather sterile. A surface decoration is created by cutting into the clay diagonally and pressing out from the inside. Glazing of bisque-fired ware is accomplished by dipping. Once the teacups and the flower vase have been coated, they will be placed in the kiln. There, the brown glaze will turn white in the firing. The finished glaze, called shino, has many small pittings that reveal the orange cast of the clay. The most famous tea ceremony ware is raku. This is a black raku tea bowl. For centuries, tea masters have preferred this unpretentious ware. This red raku tea bowl is held in the traditional fashion. In Kyoto, at the raku factory, ware is fired at low temperatures and for a brief time, just long enough to melt the glaze. The pieces are placed in a round, barrel-like kiln which has no stack, the smoke coming right out into the room. Members of the same family of potters have been making raku teaware for over 400 years. This man is the 14th generation. When he sees that the glaze is sufficiently melted, he removes the covering pieces and snatches out the pottery. Here, little dishes for serving cakes, and places them on fire brick to cool. From time to time, he quenches the tongs in water to keep them from sticking to the hot glaze. While the kiln is open, it loses heat rapidly. Therefore, it is reloaded immediately and covered. Within 20 minutes, the heat builds up again and melts the glaze. Each firing cycle, loading, heating, and unloading, takes about 30 minutes. With continuous firing, 16 loads can be completed in one day. Thus, the visits to Mr. Roksai, Mr. Kaneshigi, Mr. Shimaoka, Mr. Kato, and the raku factory help one to appreciate traditional methods of making Japanese pottery.
The spoked wheel is made from wood and cement and rests upon a pivot in the ground. He turns it while squatting, engaging the pole with the notch. The speed of the wheel depends upon the skill of the thrower and can maintain its momentum for 10 minutes. A wide range of vessels are produced here to fulfill the needs of local communities. There are pots for storing liquids and dry grains, cooking pots, and pots for ritual ceremonies of birth, death, and marriage. The continual practice giving her speed and dexterity. Potters in Kutch are highly regarded for the quality of their work, especially in the rich and varied tradition of decoration. The women divide the pots into horizontal bands and fill each section with painted designs, using elaborate systems of lines, dots, and motifs. They work whilst chatting and keeping an eye on their children. Throughout India, potters either fire in the open or use rudimentary kilns. This is a triangular-shaped kiln, with its apex at the front. Raised up on a bed of ash, it's sited at the far corner of the compound. Mohammed digs a pit into the ash and piles it around the edges, forming a wall to enclose the pots. The main fuel for the firing is brushwood collected from the indigenous wild thorny bush. Straw is cut and compressed into the bottom of the pit, followed by a thick layer of brushwood. The crucial decision of placing pots is only taken by Mohammed or his father. Each pot is carefully placed upside down and supported on a shard. All potters in India make use of their shards or broken pots. Here, the grandsons cover the pots with shards, which will help to retain the heat during firing. Over time, these potters have developed techniques to pack the maximum number of pots and fire them with a minimum amount of fuel. Gradually, over the next few hours, the pit is filled until the pile is 90 centimeters high and contains 300 pots. Packing a kiln is labor-intensive work and requires all members of the family to help. Harabai, Mohammed's wife, rakes up straw from the yard and throws it onto the pile. Ash is shoveled onto the kiln, which will help to insulate the pots during firing. The fire mouth is the neck of a water pot into which Mohammed places burning straw. It's late afternoon and the firing will take about 14 hours to burn through. He sprinkles water around to prevent it igniting too fast.
The villagers follow the tradition of replacing their earthenware vessels during religious festivals. Local clay is collected in rock form and must be carefully prepared for successful pottery production. The whole family helps in the long and arduous clay preparation. Sieved ash is spread on the ground, while the clay is mixed with water and powdered horse dung inside a container set in the ground. A narrow-mouthed pot covered in holes is used like a sieve to smooth out the lumps before the clay is thrown onto the ash. The potter's son uses his feet to wedge the clay, which has been mixed with yet more ash. Along with the horse dung, the ash acts as a strengthening agent to prevent the pots from cracking during firing. Finally, the prepared clay is formed into a mound and covered with plastic, ready to use. This potter is making a water pot. She prepares the curved hollow sitter with ash. After a drying period, the pot is ready for the beating stage. Supporting the pot in a depressed hollow lined with sacking, the potter begins to shape and thin the pot by using a stone anvil held inside and a wooden paddle hit against the outside. These grain containers have also been made by coiling and beating. Just before the firing, red clay slip called geru is applied. Finally, strips of arita tree beans are dipped into kerosene and rubbed over the surface of the pot to give a burnish or sheen. The firing pit slopes down to the back and is lined with bricks. Potters use local agricultural waste for firing, and 4 furrows of rice husks are made, leaving gaps in between for stoking channels during the firing. The grain containers are supported on bricks tilting back with their mouths away from the front of the pit. Buffalo dung is ignited in straw and buried at intervals in the rice husk to provide a slow preheat. It'll be 4.5 hours before the final firing begins. Now water pots are placed inverted onto the pile to allow an even temperature rise, then covered with shards to help retain the heat during the firing. Sticks are placed to mark the position of the stoking holes. The pile is covered with bundles of rice straw, compressed down by beating. Finally, a mixture of rice husk and ash is spread over everything to contain the fire and prevent the straw from flying away. Some Indian potters fire at midday to take advantage of the hot sun but here they fire at night in order to gauge the temperature by the red glow. Wood is stoked through the stoking holes right to the back of the pit until the desired temperature is reached. Next day, and the whole family helps to unpack the kiln. Everyone is pleased that only 3 pots have cracked out of a total of 200.
For several hundred years, the Catawba River Valley in Piedmont, North Carolina, has supplied many potters with good quality clay. From the time of the settlers on into the 1930s, this part of Lincoln County has been the site of dozens of pottery shops. Now there's only one, at the home of Berlin Craig. Berlin is the last active folk potter in North Carolina. For more than 50 years, he has kept to the traditional methods of digging his own clay, mixing it, making his own glaze, and firing a variety of stoneware pots. Are you the only person around here using a wood-fired kiln now?
Yeah, I'm the last one, I guess.
Is that right?
Using a wood-fired kiln.
The kiln that Berlin uses is called a groundhog kiln because most of it's underground. It was built during the 1930s from handmade bricks made from clay dug right out of the pasture. Berlin digs his clay in a swamp along the Catawba River, laboriously hauling it out in 5-gallon buckets and a wheelbarrow. What kind of clay is this?
This is what they call stoneware clay. They claim that the tale is that the Indians found it where the buffalo crossed the river. The Indians got clay there to make pipes and dishes and stuff before the white man. What we call the old Rhodes clay hole. People been getting clay there probably for, well, for 200 years maybe, probably longer.
The clay now is hard, dried lumps and must be soaked before it can be put in a mixer called a pug mill. The pug mill grinds the clay to a consistency suitable for turning a pot. Berlin used to use a mule to grind the clay, but he says the mule got too expensive to keep. So now he uses his tractor, rigged together with a truck rear end and a big pulley wheel to turn the mixing blade. Berlin told me how as a boy he had seen the big wheel in a hydroelectric generating plant. Years later he had rescued it from a scrap pile in a farmer's field to use here. In just about 10 minutes, the pug mill turns out clay ready for use.
That's to get the air bubbles out of it, air out, and to make it the same all through the clay. You don't have to do that, but it'll turn better if you slice it up that way. I can remember when there was about 4 shops going right inside of here where I live. And it was made all in this area, maybe, 40 or 50 different places, maybe over a period of 100 years. Well, the Leonards, the Reinhardts, and the Hiltons, and Basses, and all just different weavers, and lots of different people made pottery. Well, I think it was on account of the clay. It was fairly handy. They could get clay, and then to learn to be a potter, you just about have to have some of your people, your father or somebody like that, you know, making most of the time. Suddenly. And at one time got started, then the younger people learned, and it kept spreading out. I was raised up the road here about 2 miles on a farm, and my father we farmed, had mules, and this neighbor out here made pottery. And I got to grind in his clay. He didn't have a mule, and I got taking my dad's mule and grinding his clay for him when I was about 12, and I got interested in it. I'd make me 25 cents for bringing the mule down and grinding a couple of mills of clay for him. And I got interested in the turning then, and I got to started turning when I was about 14. And I've been at it ever since. When I was working with Mr. Lynn, we were in partners together. We divided what profit there was. But then after he got disabled to work and I went to work for Reinhardt's, I worked for so much a gallon, turned for 2 cents a gallon. I'd turn about 100 gallons a day, make $2. That was better than working at the sawmill for $1 a day. We hauled them to the general stores, and the hardware stores handled them. We hauled it Spruce Pine, Morganton, Spruce Pine, Asheville, and places like that. Back in that Big Toe River and Little Toe River country, people up there used them to pickle beans.
The designs Berlin uses for his pottery are a mixture of tradition and his own ideas. He is perhaps best known for his face jugs.
Always start with the nose. Put the nose on first. And the eyes. Sometimes I'll try to copy somebody that I saw or something, but most of the time I just make a face. Now we'll get the ears. Well, they say the face jug originated in Africa. Now, I don't know, but the African people made them and put them on the graves of their people to keep the evil spirits away. And when they brought the slaves over here, then they made them over here, and the white people ended up to make them. That's another face jug.
What do you call this?
This is the glass beater. This is where I beat my glass to make my glaze.
Uh-huh. That's a pretty incredible piece of ingenuity right there.
Well, you see how it works. When that box gets full of water, it goes down. The water dumps out, then that drops the steel piece back into this little box where the glass is in. There's a piece of railroad iron in the bottom of that box, and that comes down on that iron and beats the glass.
And this will beat fast enough for you to get enough glass to work?
Oh yeah, I don't have to keep it going all the time. It beats more than I really need.
Is that right? I mean, night and day, I guess.
Yeah, it's going all the time. It never stops.
What's the best kind of glass for you to use?
Well, the scrap glass from window panes of the hardware stores, any place where they cut glass, you know, you gotta get some scraps, and then any kind of throwaway drink bottles or whiskey bottles, beer bottles, anything like that will make glaze.
I notice you've got colored glass. Now, that doesn't make any difference?
That doesn't change the color of the glaze, no.
Uh-huh. This is really something. I want to watch it one more time. So now you take this pulverized glass and mix it with ashes and slip clay, and that's your glaze?
That makes the glaze, yeah.
Let's go back and see how you put that on the pots.
Okay. Actually, your glass is more or less a clear glaze, and what's under it is what gives it the color. And the harder your pot's burnt, why, the darker your glaze will show up.
When it's full, Charlie crawls out for the last time. Now the entrance will be bricked up and it'll be ready for firing the first thing the next morning.
Oh yeah, got a good shot.
A single brick is left that can be removed to check on the progress of the firing.
Ready for the fire. Okay. Let's start it.
The firing of a groundhog kiln takes all day and into the night. It has to start slowly. Too much heat too fast will cause the pots to crack and break.
You don't want to fire too fast. If you do, it'll blow up. Go like a dynamite way down in the ground, something way deep, the way it sounds when one blows up. You can hear it. You'll know it when it blows up.
Believe it or not, this entire stack of pine wood will all be gone by the time the firing's done.
You can use some poplar or oak when you start, but it don't make a blast. It'll burn your pottery up. Oak or poplar, it don't make the blast like pine would.
For most of the day, it's a matter of keeping the fire stoked to maintain the proper heat. It will be late in the afternoon before Berlin decides the kiln is ready to have the heat cranked up. The smoke belching from the chimney may startle people passing by, but neighbors know it's time to head over to Berlin's and wait for the blast-off. All three stoke holes are jammed with wood, sending a wall of flame roaring through the kiln. You're getting down on your wood now.
Yeah, we are. We're getting close to it.
How much longer do you think?
About 45 minutes, maybe.
And then you just let it die out?
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Finally, Berlin decides it's done, and the fire is allowed to die down. As the pots cool, they glow a cherry red. As they get a little cooler, the colors of the glazes begin to show. But it'll take a couple of days before everything has cooled off enough to take it all back out. The excitement of the firing is hard to beat, but it's just as exciting to go to a pottery sale. At Berlin's, it's become sort of a community event. When it's time for Berlin's sale, usually in the fall, people just seem to know. It's never advertised, word just spreads.
Well, if it weren't for Berlin, we all wouldn't be here today. He went on alone for about 20 years, keeping the Catawba Valley tradition alive. And then, thankfully, in the last 10 years, his son Donald, Charlie Lisk, Kim Ellington, Joe Reinhardt across the street, and about half a dozen other potters have come into this. And so there's going to be a tradition here after Berlin leaves us.
Berlin is often amused when he hears people refer to him as an artist.
I don't consider myself an artist. No farmer that makes some pottery. That's what I am.